Welcome everyone. Welcome to the August 2024 BioBites. My name is Jessica Frank and I'm the Biological Medicine Program Manager at the Marion Institute. If this is your first time to BioBites, welcome. This is the Marion Institute's monthly educational series on all things related to alternative health, natural healing, and biological medicine, where we bring guest experts on to speak about key topics relating to wellness and empowered health. Before we roll right into our presentation, I want to let you know what you can expect from today's webinar. Please keep your mics muted for the duration of the presentation since we are recording it. But feel free to let us know right now in the chat function from where you're joining. We love seeing people coming from all parts of the world. So the majority of today's webinar will be both Dr. Thom and Julie Thom presenting and demonstrating on how unrecognized trauma and biological medicine are connected. Then toward the latter half of our hour together, we will have a moderated Q&A. So if you have a question that comes to mind while they are presenting, please just type that into the chat and I will field those questions to them during the Q&A portion toward the end of our time together. In addition, we will be sending out the recording of this episode within about 24 to 48 hours to your email inboxes, along with the slide presentation too. So look for those in the coming days. And it will also go up on our YouTube channel, the video will, and that's at Marion Institute TV. Finally, I'll go ahead and announce that our next BioBites is on September the 3rd, and that will feature a very dear friend of the MIs, the Marion Institute's, Dr. Martin Hart of Keystone Total Health. Dr. Hart will be speaking about ways to reduce our exposure to toxic PFAS chemicals and ways that we can help detox our bodies through biological medicine. And that's called Breaking Up with Forever Chemicals. And I'll also drop a link to that registration in our chat shortly. And make sure that you're getting our emails and following us on our social channels in order to stay informed of our upcoming events. Speaking of upcoming events, now on to our program for today, Hold It to Heal It. Today's topic takes the very real and pervasive issues of chronic illness and disease and looks at them not just from the symptomatic or pathological present, but the historical past, from childhood, infancy, and even preconception and beyond. Through proven techniques rooted in natural therapies and biological medicine, like emotional self-regulation, mindful movement, and energy medicine, we can be our own scientists, exploring the past and revealing it in the light of day in service of our own healing. So this special BioBites is a preview of what you can expect when we hold a 3-day in-person workshop on this very topic in October at the legendary retreat center Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. There you will have the opportunity to immerse yourself in these experiential exercises and take home the lessons you hear today, all from the beautiful fall setting along the Hudson River Valley. So about today's guests, joining us from Scottsdale is Dr. Dickson Thom, among the foremost practitioners and educators in biological medicine in North America today. He's the author of the book, Begin Again, Trauma, Disease, and Healing with the Brain Protocol in Biological Medicine. Dr. Thom has more than 45 years of clinical experience helping thousands of patients overcome chronic illness and heal from trauma. Joining us from Ontario, Canada, is his daughter, Julie Thom. Julie is a trauma-informed movement specialist, a wellness coach, and the founder of Fitomize Fitness. She's an avid traveler, mother of 2, and also the co-host of a great podcast where you can learn a wealth of great information called Connecting with the Thoms. So happy to have them here. So without further delay, please welcome Dr. Dick Thom and Julie Thom to our BioBites webinar. Take it away, doctors.
Thank you very much. Let me see if we can get the slides up here. Oh, there we go. All right. All right, Julie, we're going to let you start. We'll give these people something to do to start off with.
All right, I'm the action-oriented person. So what we're going to do to start this webinar off is we're going to actually check in on your vagus nerve and check in on your body. So the first thing that you could do is check your uvula. So if you don't know what your uvula is, it is something that is that little dangly thing in the back of your throat. So you may have to go to the mirror and get your phone light to look at. But what you want to do is you want to check to see if that uvula is pulling straight back. And the way you do that is you say, ah, ah, ah. And you look at that uvula. And what we want to see is that if it's pulling to the left or the right, that's a sign that your vagus nerve is a little bit dysregulated. So it may be a little bit hard. So I understand that this is something that you can do a little bit later, but it's just something just for you to be able to check in on you. The second option, what I would like you to do is I want you to reach right behind your ears, and I just want you to gently touch just at the base of your jaw behind your ears and just feel, does it feel tender there? And just notice, what does it feel like? Is there something uncomfortable? Is that you're just bringing awareness to what does it feel like behind there? And then what you're going to do is you're going to come down to your side of your throat and right to the base of your throat. There's a little hole here, and you're going to push a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right. And notice, is there any tenderness? Yes or no. So again, we're just bringing awareness to. And then coming down, see I have a zipper on my shirt, coming down right to your sternum. I want you to press up the sternum on the inside of your ribs on the left and the right, and notice, is there any tenderness there? And I just want you to bring awareness to it right now. And if there is, we'll show you how to release that tenderness at the end of this webinar. So if you're unaware, today we're going to be talking about trauma and how it can get trapped in your body. But first we need to start with the definition of trauma. So trauma is an experience characterized by a sense of threat, disconnection, isolation, or immobilization that leads to a prolonged state of dysregulation in the body's organ systems. Trauma affects various critical systems, including your nervous system, endocrine system, your immune system, as well as impacting your emotional body, heart, and spirit, especially when you remain in a non-optimal state over an extended period of time.
So these, the interesting thing about trauma, and everybody who is listening today, and patients who I've seen for the last, half century, many people say, when they think of trauma, it's like, no, I've not really had any trauma, because I ask every patient that, especially with new. So trauma is an experience, and whether you believe it or not, it is an unexpected threat to one's emotional well-being and physical well-being, because it elicits these intense feelings. Very often, we're not even aware of what that feeling is. But over time, what ends up happening is it creates a sense of helplessness, creates a sense of terror, it creates a sense of being in isolation. And what ends up happening, and what in reality has happened to most of us, and if somebody thinks that since we're still alive and we've lived through COVID was one of the greatest aspects of creating trauma to the entire world, that basically went on for a couple of years, and has had and will continue to have a pretty significant impact on people's health as we move forward. Because what we know is that the prolonged exposure to these repetitive and severe events causes very severe and very lasting effects in general. So when trauma happens, the person is rendered helpless. And what we're talking about rendered helpless means your physiology is rendered helpless. It goes into a different state. It's not normal functioning. Things are imbalanced. Every organ, all our 12 organ systems are working the way they're supposed to be working optimally. So in other words, in some aspect, some parts of your body have to go on defense. They have to go into this protective mode, if you like. And what happens in time, and it's not just a event, although a event easily does that when they're particularly traumatic events that are happening. So it creates this sense of exceeding our ability to control. It exceeds our ability to connect for what's happening, and the severity of the event itself. You can't really measure it. You can't say, well, what just happened? We're not hooked up to a whole bunch of machines, in an artificial setting. But so the effort to try and quantify what the effect of the trauma was is really not helpful. So we have to look at experience. But the key aspect, whether you think that you've experienced or not, is the sense of helplessness and of terror. So I like this picture because everybody knows about the Titanic, and it wasn't what was above the water that was the big issue as far as the Titanic sinking. It was the iceberg that was below the water that ripped a hole in the hull in general. So what we call is that the obvious traumas, when you ask somebody about trauma, is we call them the big T's. These are the ones that immediately come to mind when somebody says, "Have you ever experienced trauma or not?" And they said, "No, I've not had any trauma." And then what they're saying is, "No, I've not had any of what we're going to show you as the big T." But I can virtually guarantee that everybody who's listening has had many of these little T's, the things that are under the water, these everyday type things. And when do you experience them? Literally from a moment of preconception, through conception, through pregnancy of your parents, through delivery, through childhood, et cetera, et cetera. And so what ends up happening, that all these little traumas, these little T's, the brain is not capable of interpreting everything and remembering all these specific events. However, they do get implanted into the brain.
So this is just a very quick snapshot of some examples of big T and little t traumas. And so I realize that for some of you, you may look at the top of the little t list and to say divorce or separation could actually be construed as a big T. So the idea is just here is to give you an example of different types of what's considered big T, little t, based on ACE scores, based on research. So, I mean, this is just a snapshot. This is just a glimpse of what could be construed as trauma. The reality is that my dad and I have both, working with people for 70 plus years between the two of us, is that many people don't acknowledge or have the awareness that they have a big T or little t. And so, like my dad said, so the first step to healing that I talk about with my clientele and my community is the first step is awareness. So this chart is really just to give you an idea or have an awareness that you may have trauma trapped in your body.
I would say that the greatest reason that people are not aware of whether or not they've had trauma or not is because of perception. Perception is your interpretation of what something that you have experienced, of whether it's something that put you into the state of what you would consider helplessness, or trauma or fear, that kind of thing. So it's very different from person to person. And in practice, I always I give this example many times in seminars that I do, of having a set of identical twins. And 4 or 5 years of age, their grandmother passed away, and for one of the twins, it was like the end of the world, and the other twin was, "Oh, it's too bad grandma died." And it's like, so here you have somebody, the same genetics, the same upbringing, same grandparents. For one person, it was like very devastating. For the other twin, it was like not that big a deal. So that the perception that you experience has a lot to do with what happens as far as your health is concerned as time goes on. So when we look at the 3 T's of trauma, there's the event, whatever the event is. You just saw the list of big T's and little t's. It's how you individually experience that particular event. And then what are the effects? Many times people experience have the event, experience the event, and then are not aware of what the effects are. And maybe it's like if especially the little t, you think it's like, oh, that wasn't such a big deal. And as a physician, I'll listen to a person tell me what their story is, and as a human being, I'll say, wow, that is something that to me is like, oh, that's an everyday event. It really was that's such a big deal. Well, once again, it really comes down to the individual's perception of what the issue is. So we have these type of things. Phil, you can talk about those.
Yeah, so there's some typical traumatic events. So the abuse is the big one. So adverse events of childhood, some violence, physical, emotional, sexual trauma, witnessing violence or bullying, stalking. So we're hearing now, teenagers are committing suicide more and more and more now. So there's this can be definitely construed as a big T. We have loss, death, abandonment, neglect, war. I've heard of people, the fires in California. I've heard of stories of people losing their home and then, move, build another home, and then they get, and then they lose their home again. Like that's some major loss and some traumatic experiences that they've gone through. Accidents. So I fell out of a tree. I did not know when I was a kid. I fell out of a tree and basically a stump of a branch, like I stabbed my shin in it, and it basically saved my life. I didn't think that was trauma, but the reality is it was. I almost died, but it was just something like, okay, I was a kid. I didn't know. So, and then we have major stressors. And so the medical, I hear this a lot with my own personal clientele, like medical and illnesses, chronic fatigue, any kind of dis-ease. Typically, when we experience too much stress in our bodies, it does add up. Poverty, homelessness, racism, historical traumas. So, like we have parents who and grandparents and great grandparents who fought in wars and experienced a lot of different types of adversity, oppression, family members with abuse, substance abuse. These are all typical traumatic events that we most think of when we think of trauma. But the reality is there's things that are deeper as well.
This on that slide is a pretty amazing statistic that the number one cause of death of people, under age 46 is trauma. And I guarantee you that's not something that maybe some of you have heard of that statistic before, but when you look at the slide, I mean, everybody said, oh yeah, well, what is the most common cause of death in the Western world? And heart disease is number one. Cancer is number two, and we have COPD, heart, lung disease, etc. But the reality is like, who tends to think that trauma is really the number one cause of death? Yet statistically, it's there. And when you look at these types of statistics, you look at the fact that they're saying 70%, and forget the year when I found this particular slide. So we're going to say it's a couple of years old. So they're saying there's like 225 million people in this country who have experienced trauma to a significant impact, to a significant effect that it's affecting your everyday life. We do know that trauma has an incredibly impactful aspect on how we interact with life, how we interact with other people, how we experience life. A woman is beaten every 15 seconds, a forcible rape every 6 minutes. Those are typically thought of, oh, those are big T's, and they are definitely big T's. So it's like when somebody says, no, that's not happened to me. So they tend to not put themselves into this category. We see that, 1/3 of youths in the community are exposed to violence and have some aspect of post-traumatic stress. So, what we're suggesting is there's probably not anybody in this country, or for that matter, on the planet who basically have not, in some aspect, had trauma that's affecting their everyday, how they interact with the world on an everyday basis for right now.
So the reality is trauma affects the brain, and the two key areas that are important for you to know about are the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala is part of the brain. It's part of your threat system. It's basically your fire alarm. So what happens is that when we experience trauma, this fire alarm is constantly being set off, and then it triggers a fight or flight response or a stress response. So depending on the threat, you could fall into different responses, which we'll get to a little bit later. But what's important is that this little part of the brain is very, very important, and it affects releasing 31 different hormones. in your body. And so if your body constantly feels like it's under threat, you're going to have an endocrine issue, you're going to have some hormone issues. And then the other part of the brain that trauma affects is the hippocampus. And this is where we store and remember information. So it's like, as the slide says, it's like the librarian that tags it with memories. So the reality is, the hippocampus doesn't know if it's in the past, in the future, or now. So this is where, like when we talk about trauma, we can end up re-traumatizing ourselves because the hippocampus remembers the events from there. And then on the next slide, this actually shows what actually happens, when we experience trauma. So the reality is the prefrontal cortex actually shrinks. And this is the area of the brain where mood, rational thoughts, and emotional regulation happen. So this part of your brain actually gets smaller. And then as a result, again, the amygdala becomes overactive. And this is, your body's in a constant stress, fight, or flight response. And then, like I said before, the hippocampus shrinks. So then it doesn't know if it's in the past or the present. So people with PTSD, CPTSD, these parts of the brain are then, they're altered, they're changed. So this basically keeps us in this constant loop of fight or flight and can cause health issues down the road. And this is why it's important to acknowledge that trauma is in the body. It gets trapped in the body because of this. So your brain is actually responding in a way to keep you safe as best it can. So what we want to be able to do is help you restructure and help you rewire your brain.
So why is this such a big deal? Like, why are these traumas, whenever they're experienced, such a big deal? They're a big deal because they actually are altering how we have learned to adapt over the 310,000 years that Homo sapiens have sort of been on the planet in the form that we recognize. So what ends up happening is that we end up an overdevelopment of the survival brain, and that's at the expense of the learning brain. And that's what the brain protocol therapy that I evolved over the last 30 years is really about. How can we ultimately change the brain that has been developing throughout our entire life? It has a significant impact on our stress response, these little t, big T's, and it reduces our immune system activity. And it should be no surprise that we know that at age 50 there's a significant change in our immune system. They have, everybody looks at hormones, everybody looks at our microbiome that we know changes in our gut for about that age. And it's like, but I wonder how many people are actually looking at the aspects of truly of the traumas that have occurred in those 50 years and how the person has learned to deal with that. It has significant impact on our ability for our brain, how it thinks, how we learn, how we make conscious judgments, etc. And the two most sensitive times that these are impacted are around age 2, which is phase 2 of the 7-phase brain protocol, and then in the late pre-adolescence, which is the late phase 3, and then the adolescence phase, which is phase 4. So, which is, which we'll go over at Omega in October, per se, when we look at the different stages that we ultimately are going through. So the trauma and the brain, you see that little picture there, you see the 3 brains, the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, and the neocortex brain. Those are the 3 aspects of the brain that basically make up the remedies that I evolved and developed to make the brain protocol. And so, the reptilian brain is why reptiles are the oldest surviving animal, if you like, on the planet. They have been here 225 million years or so, long before the dinosaurs showed up. They've been here since the dinosaurs left. It's because they don't have the aspects of the limbic brain, which is the emotional part of the brain. And when you have trauma that comes into play, you see that the typical development is flipped upside down. And we basically spend most of our time in survival, as opposed to basically developing higher levels of cognition. And so trauma has that impact And so you can just imagine what's happening in the world right now, and the very tumultuous, think of the Middle East, think of Ukraine, think of the southern border of this country, et cetera, and you start to understand that the impact that these types of day-to-day events are having on people as they age and mature, and why in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years from now, there's such a significant impact for people.
And the lasting impact of these experiences, when people think about trauma, we talk about how it affects us, our mental health. So when you think, you've experienced trauma, you go to talk to a therapist, you go talk to, a psychotherapist, not a physiotherapist, a psychotherapist, or some type of, you're going to talk it out, right? So we think of, trauma, it affects you in a way that you develop depression, anxiety, psychosis, substance abuse, eating disorders, personality disorders, as you can see. So, but the reality is trauma can impact us in other ways. The physical health, many of us don't actually think about how trauma could impact your coronary artery, or your liver, or how it affects your lungs with, developing COPD or autoimmune diseases or chronic pain or insomnia. So when people think, I have insomnia, they don't think, oh, it's trauma. But what we want to do is help you understand that there possibly may be a link to that, or your digestive issues. I had, chronic digestive issues for a long time, when I was swimming, and I just thought, I just had poor gut flora. Never even thought about trauma, was not on my radar. Chronic fatigue, that was something that I was diagnosed as well. I was 20 years old and I had chronic fatigue. How's that possible? So this is the thing, is realizing that trauma is not just mental, it actually impacts your physical health and also your behavioral health. So how you manage your relationships, how do you think, the thoughts that you have every day, is your normal everyday life, are you stuck in hypervigilance? Do you avoid people, places, and activities? Like, I can tell you now that I'm in perimenopause, peopling can be a lot. And sometimes it takes its toll. And, those intrusive thoughts, those sleep disturbances, who in perimenopause has not had a sleep disturbance, right? So there's these things, this irritability, this anger, these emotions, where they come from. The reality is these can come from trauma being trapped in your body. That guilt, that shame, the societal withdrawal. These are the things it's really just, I want to make the point that it's not just mental health, it is physical, behavioral as well.
I'm just going to make a comment before going to the next slide. How many people do you think have gone to a cardiologist? They maybe have had an MI, they may have had some form of a coronary artery cardiovascular accident. And after he puts them on a statin and a high blood pressure med and a blood thinner, et cetera, does he say, okay, now that we got that stabilized, now we need to deal with the trauma of why you had it in the first place? Which of course doesn't happen in medicine. And you could take any of those conditions there and say the same thing. It's like, are we really trying to address the problem, or are we just trying to cover it over? And of course, that's the reason we talk about biological medicine, because the goal is not to just cover it over. The goal is to help you feel better, understand what the problem is, but truly get to the true core of what the issue is. And that's why, my bias is biological medicine is really the only real way, if you truly are looking for the true root of the problem. And we have this, this picture that's been, most people are now familiar with, where we had adverse childhood experiences, which means that, and high percentage of children unfortunately do, but underneath that lies this generational aspect, the historical trauma. In Canada, you think of, what happened to the natives. In this country, we think of what happened with slavery. We think of what happened to the natives in this country. The aspects that are laid down to our present day generations. And then the social conditions under which people have been raised. These adverse childhood experiences are cumulative. We'll talk about them quite a bit during the 3-day workshop. In general, and it doesn't take very many of those to have, unfortunately, a premature death, and which is what's happening, unfortunately, for a lot of people. So the aspects of these many times big T's, but often little T's that we all end up being experienced by, is a true aspect of why we are experiencing the problems that we are in society as far as health is concerned.
So many of you may know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how our basic needs need to be met in order for us to feel safe within our environment, within our own bodies. But the reality is, when we experience trauma, the key is really about finding safety first, and not necessarily the food, water, warmth, or rest being the priority. So it's important to just acknowledge when we approach healing, it's from a trauma-informed approach. It really is important to take safety into consideration. And so I say safety, and I tend to use it in air quotes, because some people will use a different word of what safe feels like. But the idea is, we need to feel something within us, in our cells, in our soul, if you will, in your spirit. We need to be able to feel that inside interoceptively, and outside extraceptively and proprioceptively. And this will impact how we move our bodies, and how we live, and how we feed our bodies, and how we interact with the world. So the idea is, in this hierarchy of needs, is there is a slight adaptation to Maslow's hierarchy of needs when we consider trauma. So just wanted to say that. And then we move on to the next slide. So what's important to understand is that when we experience trauma, there are actually 7 F's, 7 stress responses. Most people know fight or flight. Freeze maybe is a new one. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are the typical 4 that you'll hear on social media. But what's important to understand is that there's actually 7. And the other 3 we talk about are flag, faint, and flow. So the flow comes from, if you know Stephen Porges, he created in 1994, he developed basically presented the world with the polyvagal theory. And it talks about how every mammal on this planet, our intention to live life is for social connection, it's social engagement, and flow is that opportunity for you to feel that space. So here's a chart that I've created to help you understand. If we just take a upside down stoplight, the reality is everyone wants to live in flow. We want to live in this place of safety and connection. We want to have that engagement with with other mammals, and this is where the concept of co-regulation comes in. It's really important that we have that connection with other people. But sometimes, like my daughter struggles with some trauma that's from me and utero and all that stuff, and I recognize that. And something that she struggles with is making friends. So she spends a lot of her life in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is, the center circle, where most people, when we talk about, what happened to you or how are you living your life, you often hear them like, I'm always overwhelmed, or I'm always stressed, or I'm always busy. That's like, you hear how many people have said, oh yeah, how are you doing? Oh, I'm really busy, right? This is this middle response that we end up, our nervous systems are responding in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So fight meaning, like there's mobilization. So the center circle is really about how am I moving, or how am I, like fawning is about people pleasing. It's about, keeping friendships, even though it's not necessarily best for you, but that connection is more important, overrides how you actually get along with, other people and whatnot. Freeze is a common state now. A lot of people, because they, want to do something, but it's like they're just stuck. They don't know how to respond. So their nervous system typically gets stuck in this hypervigilant state. So it's a sympathetic state. And then we obviously have the red state. This is the dorsal. This is the most primal part of you. This is that shutdown or disconnection or immobilization. So there are 2 different types of immobilization. So flagging is basically characterized as an emotional detachment. So if you're that person that you end up scrolling, or you go on Netflix and you binge watch, or you have that brain fog that you're struggling with, this is you flagging. This is your nervous system showing signs that you're too overwhelmed. And so we just need to take it down, and we need to distract ourselves. So if you try to disengage or disconnect, This is you in a flag state. And then the most primal part of you is the faint or flop, which basically means your nervous system, like you need to lie down, you need to be in that horizontal position. Because the reality is, if any of you check your HRV, which is heart rate variability, we know the most stressful thing you do every day is waking up in the morning and getting up out of bed. So what happens is that our nervous systems, as soon as we sit up, that could be construed as a stress response. So your body will then, create dizziness or those migraines or, all these different issues as soon as you go vertical. And so your body's going to do what it needs to do to immobilize you and shut you down. So it wants you to go into that horizontal position. And that's just your dorsal primal aspect of getting you to rest and recover.
So we look at, how can the same event that is traumatic for one person, be different from someone else. And it's because that, how you experience a specific event, whatever the event is varies because of a number of factors. Big factor is what was the age of onset. So we tend to think as we grow older, as we're adults, we're more mature, we have a better understanding of the world, we have a better understanding of life, but it's not necessarily true. We definitely know that babies in utero, first of all, and then babies, toddlers, children, we know that the brain doesn't fully mature, energetically develop until the mid-20s. So literally from a preconception age until our mid-20s, we are in a very susceptible state as far as different areas of our nervous system and our brain developing. The severity of the trauma, the frequency of the trauma, the duration of the trauma, the extent of the injury are all, factors that how big an impact will these have. And each age that we go through, and which I have learned over all the years of treating people with the brain protocol, based on the stages with which the individual trauma and based on those factors we just said, will have a significant impact on how you look at life. And how you interact with life and how you respond to different situations is what we call your learned perceptions. It's you have learned to react the way you do in present stress situations based on something that happened to you in the past. It's not something that happens in the moment. These reactions are all predetermined, we'll say, by previous experiences that you've had. And so depending on that age, depending on what the trauma was, your memory of that, and people say, well, I don't have any memory of it. And because the brain necessarily doesn't want to remember, but remember from the slide earlier, when we look at the hippocampus is sort of the library. It doesn't forget, it catalogs it. And sometimes people, you don't necessarily have to know what it is in order to basically recognize the fact that that doesn't need to affect me as much as it has at this point in time. But we do know that these experiences that we have had in our past do have a very significant effect on our biochemistry, our physiology, our emotional aspect of how we interact with the world. And we tend to think that the younger the age that it happens, the greater the potential of long-term damage. But thankfully, we have ways to unravel those pieces of the puzzle, which of course will be a big extent of what we're going to do at the workshop for Omega. So these are, the common reactions, and we know that children, typically up to age 5, are more likely to experience nightmares. But if you have an adult experience nightmares, and it's like, wow, there's an old trauma that probably is coming back. But whether you get physical symptoms, whether you have this hypervigilance that Julie mentioned, difficulty concentration, we have focusing problems, we have people with cognitive decline. You can think it's PTSD, you can think it's just, cognitive decline, etc. People will dissociate because of the fact they don't want to remember things, they don't want to be in specific situations. When you get into this effect where you start avoiding people or places or events, It may be because those are a subtle trigger of something that happened to you in the past, even if you have no memory of it. But it's like in the book I talk about one of my patients who I'd seen for many years, who had a specific smell and a specific color that she just detested from, had no idea why, but in the course of treating her, she was actually able to re-experience her own birth, and the smell and the color were actually in the delivery room. And she had a very unpleasant experience as a child. It was a very unpleasant pregnancy. Her mom actually didn't want her, and she was basically was an unwanted child. And that coming into life was something that affected her entirely without even recognizing that it was. But once she came to the realization that she didn't have to no longer experience that event, that smell, that color really became a non-issue. So, we think about worry and fear and people who have multiple personalities, or people who will act out in the form of anger or sadness or depression. I mean, all common, these are all everyday types of things. These are, as a physician, these are what people talk to me about, why they experience these types of things. And so what happens in society, whether you go to a psychologist, a therapist, you end up trying to cover it up. We're not suggesting that you have to live with it, but we're also suggesting that covering it up probably won't solve the problem. But we know that a great number of people take antidepressants and many of them may need it, but a good number of them actually, when dealing with some of the types of things that we are capable of dealing with, there will be a different way to be able to deal with these in a very positive way in general. So we have these, you have things that bring it up that you don't even realize. Somebody, the very common problem that patients come in with is insomnia. And so I wake up at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and which we can look at the Chinese clock and say, oh, that's something going on in your liver. They say, well, I'm not aware of it. Or I wake up and I don't know why I'm waking up. Invariably, there's often an internal trigger that is being triggered because of something from the past. But we also have external triggers that will trigger somebody's reaction, but once again, often they don't know why they're responding with the way they do. But there's this held aspect within your brain itself that is the library that has cataloged all that kind of things. So different types of things will trigger impacts of how we interact with the world.
So there's 5 steps to coping with trauma triggers that I work on with, and that I help my community with. And the first step to working with trauma and healing trauma is the T is tuning in. So it's really noticing the signs, as my dad just explained. There's internal and external signals. So really, asking what is your body and mind experiencing, and just bringing awareness to it. The root, now that you've noticed the inner experience, ground yourself using, different grounding exercises. And that's what a lot of the Omega Institute, what I'll be sharing there, is what are the actual practical tools that you can put in your tool belt to help you root and ground. Because the reality is, as we've mentioned in this entire webinar so far, is that every person, everyone has a unique nervous system, and what may work for you may not work for somebody else. So it's really understanding your own nervous system and what can help you ground. From there, you then analyze to help you ground and feel safe. It takes some time to understand what actually happened, and, and mapping out those triggers, and, mapping out your emotions from there. And it's a big piece of the puzzle of, understanding and being able to, understand why you do what you do. In my experience, has been empowering and truly helpful, because I've always been seeking answers. I've always been searching. And so many of us, are always looking for the answer, and the reality is it's inside you. And so we just need to learn how to tune in, but trauma often doesn't want us to, because who wants to feel trauma, really? So Then we move on to identifying. And so you identify your needs in the situation, and then we navigate moving forward with self-compassion and acceptance. And that's a big, big part of trauma, is that many of us, when you talk about, people with self-worth and self-compassion and how to show self-compassion to yourself, it can be very difficult. And so, this is where often we have to be shown how to do that. And that's, again, what I'll be showing you at the Omega workshop. That me?
Yeah, that's you.
Me. So a big part of my work is trauma-informed movement. And so you remember at the very beginning, we talked about everybody. So if you can just in the chat, did anybody have any tenderness in their body, or is everybody totally tender free? There's nothing showing up. This is just my body, and I'm aligned and everything is flowing. So if did just like give me a thumbs up or yes, did you feel yes, some tenderness? Okay. So we have a couple people who felt some tenderness. Okay. So what we're going to do now, do we have time? Do I have time to show you an exercise to help you release it? Do you want it, or do you have to wait for the Omega?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, 6 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to leave the cliffhanger. So you have tenderness. Too bad. Come to the workshop and I'll show you how to release it. Just kidding. Just kidding. All right. So, Dad, can you go to the next slide? So what we're going to do is one exercise or one drill I love, love, love to share with the world is the 6 healing sounds. This is from the Taoist community. So some of you may be very aware that sound is one of the fastest ways to shift your nervous system. We have a cranial nerve that has to do with the auditory system. And because it's right next to the vagus nerve, it actually helps, and the vibration and humming allows you to actually engage that vagus nerve, which calms which puts you in a parasympathetic state or rest and digest state. So what I'm going to invite you to do is we're going to start and we're going to do the 6 healing sounds together. Okay. So what you're going to do, wherever you were tender, I want you first to just rub your hands. We're going to bring some energy, rub your hands, and then place your hands either at your ears, your collarbones, at your sternum. Okay. So we're just going to bring the energy there. And then what I invite you to do is you're going to inhale. And you're going to start with the first sound. And the first sound sounds like go as long as you can. Big, long exhale. The longer the exhale, the more we get into that rest and digest and kick on that parasympathetic state. Fantastic. Okay. Second sound, when you're ready, keep your hands where it's at. All right. You can bring it again, rub the hands together, bring some heat, put a little bit of pressure, give you some love. Yes. You are worthy. So next one is chew. Ready? So you're going to inhale. Chew. Okay. So for those of you that went chew, chew, and it couldn't come out, I see you. I got you. I feel you. Okay. So for those of you that were shorter, it's okay. But it's just that have that awareness of how long was that one. Next one. Ready? When you're ready, inhale, and it's going to be a well done. Okay. So we're halfway through. Check that spot again. Everybody just do a quick check behind the ears or wherever you are. Has that tenderness gone away? Yes or no? Is it still there? Yes, it's good. It went away. Has it gone away yet? Or no, it's still there. Or I'm even more tender. What happened to your body? We're halfway there. Okay. You can put it in the chat if you like. All right, let's move on to the next one. Mine went away. Right on. Well, there you go. So we've engaged that vagus nerve. Right on, Jessica. Yay. So now let's continue on. Let's just see for any of you that are not, the next one we're going to do is ha. So go ahead and inhale. Hold that space that you had tenderness or anywhere you feel in your body, and release. Good job. Next one is who. Awesome. If you have anxiety, worry, or hopelessness in your body, that might be a good one for you to practice. Just a side note there. Just going to pin that there. All right. Last one is he. Ready? Inhale. Beautiful. Well done, everybody. All right, now double check. How does your body feel? Check all your 3 points that we did at the very beginning. How does everything feel? Are you now more in flow? Has everything released? If there is more tenderness, that's just a sign that your body's in a state of protection. Okay. So the reality is when we are tender in any way parts of our body, that's your body just trying to say, hey, I don't feel safe. Okay. Awesome. Zero tenderness. Way to go. So the reality is that we can shift our nervous systems very, very quickly, right? The short one for me too, Jen. I feel you. I see you. I got you. So the reality is there are simple ways for us to be able to shift our nervous systems. And when we learn to dial in and understand and befriend our nervous systems, it is extremely powerful. So this is a slide that is actually linked to a vagus nerve release, because the main nerve that we need to start befriending is the vagus nerve. Again, we're going to talk a lot. I don't have enough time to really talk about the vagus nerve, but what I offer is there's lots of different ways to turn on and tone, if you will, tone the vagus nerve. And this is just a chart I made to help you understand when you reset your vagus nerve, how long does it take you when you do the exercise? How long does it take you? And that is actually an indication of what nervous system state you're in. Because again, the first rule of Healing Club is awareness. So we really need to have awareness of what state is my nervous system in. And when I know that, how do I support it? And we can go from there. Because the reality is your body's always trying to heal itself. And we just need to get out of the way because we're human and we need to let it do what it needs to do best. So this is just another charts. This is something that I offer in my community, lots and lots and lots of different exercises and tools to pull in your tool belt. So we'll be going all over this in the Omega workshop. So I hope you guys can all come because it's really fun. And the reality is when you do it with people, it's even more powerful, because that's what our nervous systems are designed to do. And then finally, this is just another exercise to practice pausing. A lot of people are, a lot of people say the most important part of breathing. My dad always talks about breathing. Everybody breathe. Yes, Dad, we're breathing. But the reality is the most important time when you breathe is the space in that between each breath, that pause. There's magic there. And so what we want to do is help you practice that space between each breath. And this is just a chart that I've shared on social media often times. It's very hard to do, very easy, and to talk about it and to think about it, but to actually practice it, that's the hard part. And oftentimes we need a little bit of support and co-regulation, and that's what we're here for, and that's what I do with and what I share with the world.
So we obviously will go over these, variety of these types of things to be able to cope with the world, be able to cope with every day, to be able to cope with whatever your experiences are. So the workshop is not just, an aspect of lecture. It's a good part of it is actually going to be doing. So there's going to be some intellectual stuff, but the more important part is that when you leave the workshop on Sunday, you will have lots of tools to be able to share for yourself, but more importantly, with your family, because everybody will be experiencing a variety of different types of things. So we will have these, we'll talk about these in great detail. And as Julie said, we look forward to having you join us in Rhinebeck in the end of October. And now we'll put it back to Jessica.
That's awesome. That was great, you guys. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed doing some of those practices and felt some changes happening in my body. Just a couple of quick questions. And one of those, of course, was, can you show us something that we might be doing in Omega, which of course you did. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the differences between extero, intero, and proprioception. Can you describe the differences between those three things?
So interoception is the feeling that we have inside. So when somebody asks, how are you feeling right now? That's interoception. Exteroception is your environment. It's what's happening outside of you. So where I am in the environment. So, like I'm in a Airbnb in a bedroom, type thing, like where I am in space. And proprioception is your posture, like where you are in space, and like how your physical body is in space. Does that answer it?
Yeah, like I'm hungry. If I feel hungry, that's interoception.
Interoception. Yep.
Like where my hands are and that I'm not going to hit anything with my hands. Proprioception.
That's proprioception with
Okay.
movement. Yep. And then
And
exteroception is I'm standing or I'm lying or I'm sitting.
awesome. Okay, cool.
Or no, that's proprioception. Sorry. No. Where I am in space. So
Extra.
I'm outside, I'm inside, I am, like where I am, where I am.
Okay, great. One more. I am curious about pre-verbal traumatic events. Can you tell me about, let's say, the development in the brain specifically around hearing? So if I'm pre-verbal, but I can hear everything that's going on around me, the screaming in the next room or, the loud sounds around me, that sensitivity, tell me about the brain that helps that sensitivity. Does it amplify it or does it want to tamp it down? Do you know, Dr. Thom?
Basically, it's going to put you into potentially more survival, and that's happening. I mean, you're talking a pre-verbal aspect is going to be, from preconception, conception, in utero. We know that the baby is hearing everything because, they'll say, talk to the baby, play music, etc. And the baby is hearing all that, and they're certainly not verbal in utero, and they're not verbal other than that goo goo, et cetera, et cetera. So that information, the brain is picking it all up. The brain is sorting it. The brain is trying to figure out which compartment to put it in. And if there's a sense of, we'll say what we know is a startle reflex, that there's a surprise and your nervous system is being surprised, the brain is well aware of that, even if you can't voice it, even if the embryo or the child, the baby cannot say anything. So it's in the reptilian brain, it's in the basic brain that's all about survival. That's the brain that's being affected, and that's that slide that we showed where you start to live more in your survival brain and you lose the ability to develop the cognitive brain. It decrease that ability.
Okay, wonderful. All right, folks, that was it for our questions. And we're just at the end of our hour. I have dropped a lot in the chat for you all to check out. Some upcoming events. One, if you can't make the in-person event at Omega, we do have an 8-week course in mindfulness-based stress reduction coming up too. That's all online. So if you want to flex your awareness muscle, that's a great place to start. And I think at this point, if there's nothing else anyone would like to add, I will go ahead and sign us off and say thank you very much to Dr. Thom and for Julie Thom for being here today and for also helping us run this amazing workshop that we're going to have in October. And I will say fall in the Hudson River Valley is beautiful.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for everyone for coming.